The prairie was hushed beneath the glow of a waning moon, its silver light spilling across the crooked wooden crosses of the town's graveyard. The wind moved slowly that night, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and dust, as though the earth itself held its breath. Somewhere in the darkness, a lone coyote cried, a sound sharp enough to cut through the silence like a blade. Sarah Whitfield, a widow heavy with child, pressed her hand against her swollen belly as she walked between the graves. She carried a small lantern, its weak flame trembling with every gust. Her steps were unsteady, not from the weight of her unborn child, but from the burden that had haunted her for weeks. Her husband, Daniel, had been buried only 3 nights earlier, lowered into the soil after a fever stole his life. The townsfolk had muttered their condolences, their eyes filled with pity. But pity did not ease her grief. Tonight she returned because something felt wrong. A dream, perhaps, or the echo of his voice carried by the wind. She had awoken in her cabin drenched in sweat, convinced that something waited for her here, among the dead. The lantern's light fell upon the patch of earth where Daniel had been buried. Her breath caught in her throat. The mound was broken, soil scattered, as though clawed open by unseen hands. The coffin was gone. For a moment she could not move. Her knees weakened, and the lantern nearly slipped from her hand. She clutched the wooden post at the head of the grave, the letters of her husband's name carved into it still fresh, the edges rough beneath her fingertips. No. The word left her lips as nothing more than a whisper. Her eyes darted around the graveyard, searching for footprints, for any sign of who had dared disturb the dead. There were none she could see, only the shifting sands of the prairie, smoothed by the night wind. Behind her the gate creaked. A voice spoke from the shadows. "You shouldn't be here, Mrs. Whitfield." It was Sheriff Alden, his figure framed in the lantern light. He was a tall man with a weathered face and eyes that seemed carved from stone. His hand rested near his holstered revolver, though there was no threat in the gesture, only caution. "The coffin," Sarah managed to say, her voice breaking. "It's gone." The sheriff stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel path. He knelt by the grave, running his fingers across the disturbed soil. His brow furrowed. "Looks like it was dragged," he said quietly. "But by who, or what, I can't say." Sarah clutched her belly again. "Townsfolk in the morning," Alden finally said. "But you know how they are. Rumors spread faster than fire in dry grass. Some will say outlaws did it, others, something worse." Sarah's heart pounded. She could already hear the whispers in her mind, the cruel voices of neighbors who had always looked at her with suspicion. A pregnant widow, alone on the edge of town, living with memories of a man who never quite fit in. They would blame her. They always did. Alden placed a hand on her shoulder. "Go home. Lock your door. I'll send a deputy to watch your place tonight. Whatever this is, it isn't safe." But as Sarah turned to leave, her lantern flickered and nearly died. In that brief dimming of light, she thought she saw movement beyond the graves. A shadow slipping between the stones, tall and thin, riding low as though on horseback. When the flame steadied, the figure was gone. Her breath quickened, but she said nothing. The sheriff's gaze lingered on her, as if he too sensed the shift in the air. She returned to her cabin with the image burned into her mind, the broken earth, the missing coffin, and the phantom rider who vanished with the moonlight. Inside, she barred the door and sat by the window, staring at the night. The baby stirred again, and she whispered to her belly, her voice trembling. "We'll find him. We'll find the truth." But the truth, as the night would soon reveal, was far darker than she could imagine. Morning came slow, painting the town of Dry Creek in a pale orange glow. Dust clung to the windows, the streets empty but for a few wagons creaking by. The silence was not the peace of dawn, but the silence of people waiting, watching. Sarah Whitfield stepped out from her cabin, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. Her eyes stung from lack of sleep. All night she had sat by the window, watching shadows dance along the prairie. Every creak of the wood, every sigh of the wind had made her heart leap. But now it was morning, and she had to face the living. She walked slowly toward town. The path led past the blacksmith's shop, where Thomas Pike leaned on his hammer, pretending to work while his eyes followed her every step. She felt the weight of his stare like a stone pressing against her back. Near the saloon, women gathered with baskets in their arms, speaking in hushed tones that carried far too easily. They fell silent when Sarah approached, their gazes lowering just enough to hide their words, though not their contempt. One woman muttered, barely under her breath, "Coffin didn't walk away on its own." Sarah kept her head down. She had lived long enough in Dry Creek to know how rumors were born. One whisper was enough to sour a man's reputation, and in her case, it took only the suggestion that her husband's grave had been disturbed for tongues to wag. At the general store, old Mr. Keller sat on his porch, rocking slowly, his pipe glowing. He spat into the dirt and spoke loud enough for her to hear. "Bad omen, that missing coffin. Means there's sin left unsettled." His eyes narrowed. "Sometimes sin lives with the widow." Her stomach tightened, not only from his words but from the child moving inside her. She pressed a hand against her belly, drawing what comfort she could from the small life within. She wanted to scream, to tell them she had nothing to do with it, but the words lodged in her throat like gravel. Sheriff Alden stood near the livery stable, speaking with two men. His eyes met hers across the street, and for a moment she saw something like pity, or perhaps warning. He tipped his hat, but the men beside him leaned closer, whispering in his ear. Their faces darkened as they glanced toward her. It was then she realized the town had already judged her. They didn't need evidence. They didn't need reason. The missing coffin was enough. By noon, the whispers had grown louder. Children ran through the streets shouting, "The widow's cursed," as if it were a game. Their laughter rang sharp, cutting deeper than cruelty meant. Sarah's cheeks burned, but she walked on, refusing to let them see her falter. At the church hand, she turned away quickly, her chest tight. The world seemed to press in on her from all sides, the glances, the mutters, the scripture twisted into accusation. Inside the saloon, voices carried even through the walls. "Heard tell the coffin wasn't empty when it was took," someone said. "Heard it had something worth stealing. Maybe gold, maybe worse." "Or maybe," another voice drawled, "the widow wanted it gone, so no one could look inside." Laughter erupted, harsh and mean. Sarah quickened her pace, her boots striking the boardwalk in uneven rhythm. Her vision blurred, tears stinging at the corners of her eyes. She reached the edge of town, where the open prairie stretched wide, and there she stopped, gasping for breath. The wind swept over her, carrying the faint rattle of wagon wheels, the distant call of a hawk. For a moment she thought she heard Daniel's voice again, calling her name on the breeze. She shut her eyes, clutching her belly. "Why did they take you?" she whispered. "Why won't they let you rest?" Her answer came not from heaven, but from behind. A stranger's voice, low and rough. "Because the dead don't always stay where they're put." She spun around. A man stood at the edge of the road, his hat pulled low, his face half hidden by dust. His horse pawed at the dirt, restless. The man's eyes glinted beneath the brim. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked. "The grave, the missing coffin." Sarah swallowed hard. "Who are you?" He smiled, but it was not kind. "Someone who knows more than they want me to." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Best watch yourself, widow. Truth's a dangerous thing in this town." Before she could reply, he pulled on the reins, and the horse carried him off into the haze of the desert road, leaving only hoofprints behind. Sarah stood frozen, the whispers of the town echoing in her mind, mixing with the stranger's warning. She realized that the coffin's disappearance was more than a crime. It was a message, and she was at the center of it. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long across the street. Doors closed, shutters latched. The town of Dry Creek had turned its back on her. And in the silence that followed, Sarah felt truly alone. The desert night stretched wide and merciless, painted silver by the rising moon. The prairie grass whispered against the wind, each blade bending as if bowing to something unseen. Out here the silence was never empty. It carried secrets. And tonight, Sarah Whitfield was desperate enough to follow them. She had left her cabin hours after sundown, unable to ignore the memory of the shadow she'd glimpsed in the graveyard. The rider. The image burned in her mind, taunting her through every heartbeat. Her lantern swayed as she rode a borrowed mare from the livery, its hooves thudding softly across the sand. The trail was faint, nearly invisible, but Sarah caught glimpses of it. Deep hoofprints pressed into the earth, leading away from Dry Creek and into the wide-open desert. They gleamed like black scars under the moonlight. She leaned forward, urging the mare to keep steady, even as fear knotted in her chest. Behind her, Dry Creek lay quiet, its people huddled in shuttered homes. She had left their whispers behind, but they clung to her still, as if carried on the wind. Cursed widow, coffin thief, unclean. Each word haunted her, making her grip the reins tighter. The hoofprints veered toward the canyon, a jagged scar in the land that cut the prairie in two. Rocks jutted sharp as knives, and the wind funneled through the canyon walls like a whispering choir. Sarah slowed her mare, listening. Somewhere ahead, a hollow sound echoed, hoofbeats not her own. She froze. Her lantern shook in her hand, casting wild shadows against the canyon walls. Then she saw him, a rider cloaked in black, horse tall and spectral in the moonlight. The figure did not rush, but moved with eerie calm, as though the night itself bent to make way. Sarah's throat tightened. She urged her mare to follow, keeping her distance. The stranger never looked back, never faltered, but his pace slowed just enough for her to keep up, as if he knew she was there. The chase lasted miles, though time lost all meaning in the silence of the desert. At last the rider turned off the main trail and slipped behind a cluster of boulders. When Sarah rounded the bend, he was gone. She dismounted, lantern raised high. Her boots crunched against loose gravel, the sound too loud, too fragile in the canyon's stillness. She searched for hoofprints, for any sign of the rider, but the ground was smooth, swept clean. Then she saw it. A single mark, carved deep into the rock with a knife. The shape was crude but recognizable. A coffin, its lid half open, etched into stone. Her pulse thundered. Someone wanted her to follow. The mare snorted nervously, pawing at the light. "Who are you?" she demanded, though her words came weak. "Someone who keeps watch over the dead," the voice answered. "And your husband's coffin carries more than bones." Her breath caught. The baby kicked, as if stirred by the truth. "What do you mean?" she asked, stepping toward the sound. But there was no reply, only the echo of hoofbeats, fading into the distance. Her lantern flickered, then steadied. The canyon was empty again, save for her and the horse. She stood trembling, heart racing, staring at the carved coffin in the rock. Whoever the rider was, he wanted her to see this. He wanted her to know the truth was not buried, but waiting. Sarah climbed back onto the mare, her eyes fixed on the canyon's horizon. She knew she should turn back to Dry Creek, to safety, but safety no longer existed for her. The town had turned its back, and the shadows had chosen her. She tightened her grip on the reins. "We keep going," she whispered. The mare whinnied softly, carrying her deeper into the desert, where the moon hung like a pale, unblinking eye. Somewhere ahead, the rider waited, and with him, the secret of the vanished coffin. The desert swallowed sound as Sarah rode deeper into the canyon. The moon stood high above her like a watchful eye, pale and cold, lighting every jagged rock and twisting shadow. Her mare moved reluctantly, ears twitching at every distant echo, but Sarah pressed her onward. The carved coffin she had found on the stone had been no accident. It was a message. And messages demanded answers. By midnight, she reached what looked like a forgotten mining camp. A scatter of wooden shacks leaned drunkenly against the canyon wall, their roofs half collapsed, their windows black and empty. Once, men had chased silver here, and all they left behind were ruins for ghosts to haunt. Now the wind owned the place, weaving through broken boards and rattling old tin like a chorus of whispers. Sarah dismounted, clutching her lantern. The mare snorted and pulled against the reins, refusing to step closer. Sarah tied her to a leaning post and climbed the creaking steps of the largest shack. The planks groaned beneath her weight, brittle with rot, as though warning her to turn back. Her hand shook as she pushed the door open. The hinges screamed, and a wave of stale air rolled out, thick with dust and the faint coppery tang of something long dried. Sarah lifted her lantern high. The inside was bare save for a broken chair, a table missing one leg, and cobwebs that clung to the rafters like shrouds. But at the center of the room rested the thing that froze her blood. A coffin. Her knees nearly buckled. She recognized it instantly. The same pine box built by the town carpenter, the same brass handles dulled by dirt. Daniel's coffin. She had watched it lowered into the earth, yet here it was, propped on two sawhorses, waiting for her like some cruel invitation. Her steps faltered as she approached. The lid had been pried open, its nails bent back, leaving a dark slit wide enough to peer inside. The flame of her lantern quivered, spilling nervous light over the wood. Sarah forced herself closer. She leaned over the edge and gasped. The coffin was empty. Her husband's body was gone. A sob clawed its way up her throat, but before it could break free, her eyes caught something lying inside. Not bones, not flesh. Instead, a folded letter, sealed with dark wax. Beside it rested a knife, old and ugly, its blade crusted with what looked far too much like dried blood. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for the letter. The seal cracked beneath her thumb. The paper was yellowed and smelled faintly of smoke. She lifted it close to the lantern and read aloud in a whisper, her voice trembling. Daniel Whitfield was no simple man who had once read her psalms by firelight, who had carved a cradle for their unborn child, had written these words. Or someone else, someone who knew what he had hidden. Her knees gave way and she dropped to the dirt floor, the letter slipping from her hands. Tears stung her eyes. She had loved him with every breath. But who had she truly married? The knife glimmered in the lantern light. Its hilt was carved with strange runes, rough symbols that seemed to shift under her gaze. When her fingers brushed the handle, the air thickened, heavy and alive. The shack groaned around her, timbers straining as though the building itself recoiled. A sound rose outside. Hoofbeats. Slow, measured. Sarah staggered to her feet, lantern swinging wildly. The doorframe filled with shadow as the rider appeared. His hat brim hid his eyes, but the moonlight at his back turned him into something more specter than man. His presence filled the room like the weight of a storm. "You shouldn't have opened it," he said. His voice was low and grinding, like stone dragged across stone. Sarah's chest tightened. Why? Why take the coffin? Why leave me this? She pointed at the knife, her hand shaking. The rider stepped forward, boots thudding against the boards. He brushed his gloved fingers across the coffin's lid. "Your husband made promises no man should make. He bargained with things older than this desert. He gave blood to seal his word. And now the debt is yours." "No," Sarah whispered, backing away. "I don't understand. He was a good man." The rider's shadow loomed over her. "Good men do desperate things. He sought power he could not carry. You are his widow. His child grows in you. The debt follows blood." Her lantern shook so violently she thought it would die. "Please, I have nothing to do with this." "You do now." The rider's voice fell like a gavel. "The truth is not a gift, widow. It is a curse, and it has already chosen you." Then he turned, his coat whipping in the night air. In a breath, he was gone, swallowed by the desert beyond the shack. Only the echo of hoofbeats remained, fading into silence. Sarah sank to her knees, the knife heavy in her hands. The relic burned against her palm as though alive. The letter lay open at her feet, its words etched into her soul. The coffin was empty, but it carried more weight than a body ever could. The moon had turned red. It hung above Dry Creek like a wound in the sky, casting a bloody glow across the prairie. Shadows stretched long and sharp, cutting through the town's dusty streets. Windows rattled, shutters slammed tight, yet people gathered outside, drawn by fear as much as by curiosity. They whispered of curses, of debts unpaid, of the widow who had walked with death. Sarah Whitfield rode into town, the blood-stained knife hidden beneath her shawl. Her lantern swayed from the saddle horn, its weak flame struggling against the crimson light. Every step of her mare echoed through the silent crowd. Faces turned, mouths whispered. Some crossed themselves, others spat into the dirt. She kept her chin high, though her body trembled. The weight of the relic seemed heavier with each breath, as though it pulled at her soul. The letter's words gnawed at her. The debt follows blood. At the center of town, Sheriff Alden waited, hand resting on his revolver. His eyes searched her face, hard yet uncertain. Behind him, the preacher stood with his Bible, lips moving in silent prayer. The townsfolk formed a ring, closing her in. Then the rider appeared. He emerged from the far end of the street, horse black as coal, cloak snapping in the wind. He moved with the certainty of a man who owned the night. The crowd parted for him without a word, as though an invisible hand pushed them aside. Sarah's heart pounded. She clutched the knife beneath her shawl. The rider stopped a few paces away, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. "The coffin was found," Sheriff Alden said loudly, his voice cracking the silence. "But it was empty." "You'll answer for that, stranger." The rider ignored him, his gaze fixed on Sarah. "You carry it." Her mouth went dry. "Carry what?" "The debt," he said. His voice rolled like thunder. "Your husband swore an oath. His blood is gone, but yours remains. The child within you binds the bargain." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Fear turned quickly to anger. A woman shouted, "She brought this curse." Others echoed, their voices rising, until the air trembled with accusation. Sarah raised her voice above them, sharp and raw. "Daniel was my husband. I buried him with my own hands. Whatever oath he swore, I knew nothing of it." The rider's hand lifted, pointing toward her belly. "And yet his blood lives." The baby stirred inside her, a flutter that stole her breath. She gripped, could drive away the shadow. Sarah drew the knife from her shawl. The blade caught the moonlight, gleaming like fire. The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Her voice trembled, but it carried. "If debt must be paid, then I will pay it. But not with my child, not with his blood." The rider tilted his head, unreadable. "Then with whose?" For a heartbeat, silence swallowed the town. Then the church bell tolled, though no one had pulled its rope. A sound, deep and hollow, echoing across the desert. The rider's horse pawed at the ground. He raised his hand as though to summon her or strike her down. But before he could move, Sarah lifted the knife high, pressing the blade against her palm. Blood welled, crimson under crimson moonlight. "I give my blood," she said, her voice breaking but steady. "Let it end with me." The wind howled. The townsfolk fell to their knees, shielding their faces. The rider froze, his figure trembling like smoke. The red moon flared brighter, then dimmed, turning pale once more. When Sarah opened her eyes, the rider was gone. Only hoof prints remained in the dust, leading nowhere. She stood alone in the circle, her hand bleeding, her body weak. Sheriff Alden stepped forward, reaching for her, but stopped. The townsfolk stared in awe and fear. None dared speak. Sarah looked down at the knife, its blade slick with her blood. She felt the child move within her, alive, untouched. A tear slid down her cheek. The curse had not ended. She knew that. Debts never vanished so easily. But for now, the night was hers. The crowd slowly dispersed, muttering prayers, crossing themselves. The sheriff lingered, eyes heavy with questions he could not ask. The preacher whispered, "God help her," before retreating into the shadows. Sarah mounted her mare once more. The town lay silent behind her, scarred by what it had witnessed. She rode toward the horizon, the knife still in her hand, the future heavy with uncertainty. And above her, the pale moon shone down, bright and merciless, bearing witness to a truth that would never die.